Peugeot, as the brand is correctly pronounced, has had a little bit of a tough history in our market. Plagued by a rather lackluster distributor and relatively lackluster after-sales service, it was a brand that made excellent cars and were appreciated by the people who loved them, but it still required a degree of compromise. However, the brand has now been picked up by BERMAZ, a company with a strong history in both sales and after-sales for primarily their Mazda brand, but now represent Peugeot as well as Korean marque Kia. But a brand is only as good as the products that it puts out. And this is the first Peugeot out of the new BERMAZ distributorship. This is the 388, a 5-seater C-segment SUV with a 1.6-litre turbocharged engine up front, sharp French styling and an incredible attention to detail. Is this the C-segment SUV that you've been overlooking all this while for all the wrong reasons? My name is Aiman Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring. This is our review of the new 2022 Peugeot 3008. Now, when talking about a new Peugeot, naturally the conversation starts with styling, and the new 3008 certainly doesn't disappoint. The face has been updated for 2022, now with new full LED headlights, this new frameless grille that bleeds ever so beautifully into the bumper, and now, rather uniquely, instead of fog lights, you get this LED daytime running light that cuts from the top all the way down into the bumper to give it these fangs, which make it very distinctive at night. You still get a little bit of contrast on the front and these fake vents on the side just to make it look a little bit more interesting. Down the side, you still get the very handsome profile that we know and love with the 3008, including a generous smattering of chrome around the windows, even on the front fender and on the bottoms of the doors. You also get some functional satin roof rails as well, should you need a little bit more cargo room. Now, for the wheels, you still run 18-inch 5-spoke dual-tone alloy wheels wrapped in Continental cross-contact LX2 tires, which offer superior performance in all weather. Now, at the back, there are even fewer changes. The bumper has not been retreated at all, but what was now chrome is now done in satin silver, and we also get full LED taillights with a more intricate triple claw design, replete with scrolling indicators. The pre-facelift actually had scrolling indicators on the front. You now get scrolling indicators on the rear. The fronts no longer have that. The daytime running lights that I mentioned earlier double up as indicators. Now, of course, being a premium-ish C-segment SUV, there are plenty of goodies in the back, starting with the kick to open function, which has to be one of the most sensitive systems on the market. Now, once you get into the boot, there is plenty of space. This is actually a dual level floor, currently set in its lowest position, but this can be lifted to bring it up to the load height. When you do that, you have almost no load lip, actually no load lip at all to load stuff in and out. And the relatively low bumper and wide opening means it's very easy to put stuff in and out. As you can see, the tonneau cover has been removed as we had our equipment back here. But even with the tonneau cover in place, there's plenty of room back here for luggage. And the best part is, if this is on its higher position, if the boot floor is set to its higher position, you can actually put the tonneau cover underneath the boot floor, making it that much more practical. In terms of space, back here actually it's quite generous. This is large compared to vehicles like the Proton X70, for example, and the Subaru XV, if you consider that within this segment, which we don't. But for the most part, this is practical enough for most users. Now, the rear seats fold 60-40, and you can access that by just flipping the handles here, and because they're spring-loaded, they will fold forward. That seat's actually just being held in by the seat belt, which is something that does happen. But again, with the boot floor set to its highest position, you have no lip, which means you can very easily load stuff all the way into the back. Now, this electronic tailgate actually comes with a limiter function, so you can actually set the maximum height that this opens to. So if you have a low garage, for example, or if you have, in my case, hanging lights from your garage, you can set it so that when it opens, it doesn't smack into that light and then damage the bodywork. Of course, you can kick to close, but I suspect that's also going to be problematic as it was earlier, so I'll just press this bright red button. Now, overall, the aesthetics of the 3008 haven't really changed that much. It's all been very minor back here and minor down the sides, but the major things have come up front, like I mentioned earlier. But the interior, well, few changes, but important changes. Let's talk about that inside. Now, like I said, there have been very few changes to the inside of the 3008, but that's kind of fine because this was undoubtedly one of the best interiors on the market even when it launched. You have all these soft touch materials in all of the major places, and even some of the places you won't touch that often are still soft touch. And then on a lot of the detailing, you get this lovely fabric down on the sides and down on the dash, which make it look very pretty. You also get interior illumination around most of the door panels, again to make the car feel a little bit more special. Now, adding to this, of course, is the tactility in here. All of the buttons here, not just these piano-style keys here, but also these black buttons down here and the buttons on the steering wheel all feel really solid and really nice to use. In fact, even the switches for the indicator and the wipers all just feel really well put together, which is definitely not something that one would normally say about a Peugeot, but times have changed, so get with the program. Now, in terms of practicality, the Peugeot 3008 is actually pretty good. You have space in the middle for large bottles, which can also fit down on the doors. You get a little pocket here, which is big enough for like a card holder, and you get a Qi wireless charger in the front, which is large enough even for slightly bigger phones like my Galaxy S10. And you also still have a USB port up front for, Android Auto and that sort of thing. You also get this nice armrest, which opens up like that with a little removable cubby, and this space is actually large enough for me to be able to put my large unbranded water bottle all the way in and all the way to the front. This center glove box is actually cooled, which means that you can put drinks in there and they'll stay nice and chilly throughout your drive. Now, in terms of technology, that's where the changes have come with this car. So we now get a larger widescreen system up here with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, wired unfortunately, which means everything is displayed in this lovely, crisp sort of upper display, which looks absolutely fantastic. This infotainment system is not without its foibles. It's a pretty nice system to use. It's very easy to understand and very easy to operate, and the refresh rates are all pretty good as well, which means the processors back here are pretty good too. The trouble is, unfortunately, all of the HVAC system controls are also up here, which means you have to press a button here in order to change, for example, the direction and so on of the airflow or even the fan speed, which is a little bit irritating. However, if you want to just change the temperature, they are always displayed on these two side panels while you have Android Auto in the middle, which means it's slightly easier to access. But again, it's tap, 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 and then you have to press back to go back to Android Auto, which is not the greatest thing. The other thing is that these piano keys, there isn't a separate button that you could map specifically to bring you back to smartphone mirroring, so you have to press the apps button and then press Android Auto. So again, it's a little bit of a palaver. But aside from that, it does look good and it really enhances the sort of feel of this interior. The other thing that adds to that ambiance is this new fully digital instrument cluster, which is incredibly customizable. You have all sorts of options to change the way it displays all of that information, and you also have a personal setting for you to have the instrumentation and information that you want on either side. Now, one thing that I'd like to talk about is driving position, because I'm very comfortable in this car, but the problem with Peugeot's iCockpit design is that it requires you to move this very small, very not round steering wheel to sit below the instrument cluster and a little bit closer to you. Now, I have no issue in this car, my video editor has no issue in this car, but some people have some problems setting this in such a way where you can still see all of the dials that you need and still have this in a comfortable position and still be seated comfortably. So this is one of those cars that you really do need to go to a showroom and test drive over a slightly extended period to understand whether or not you'll be comfortable in this. But once you get the right driving position, of course aided by the fact that this steering wheel is both reach and rake adjustable, it does mean that you have a very unique driving position where you feel like you're sat in the car rather than on it per se. Visibility is pretty good. You've got pretty big door mirrors. All of these pillars have been profiled in such a way to minimize the amount of blind spot area. However, the C pillar at the back is a little bit chunky, which means over the shoulder views are a little bit tricky. Now, in addition to all of this, you get the electric leather seats up front, like I should have mentioned earlier. You get a full glass roof with an opening sunroof as well, with a blind, with more ambient lighting up there too, again just to make this car feel more premium and upmarket. Peugeot has done an excellent job with this car. Now, there are a couple of more things I want to talk about, like this gear lever and this little rotary dial selector. We'll touch on that in the driving portion. Now, I'm going to move to the back to talk about space. Since this is set up in my driving position, let's go and see if I can fit behind myself. Now, I'm sat behind myself in the 308 and I have to say that there is absolutely acres of room. I have plenty of knee room and plenty of headroom, though those around the 6-foot mark would probably need to sit back here again just to be sure there's plenty of space, although reasonably there should be. The panoramic sunroof does eat into headroom slightly, but I must say that sat back here, especially with this black interior, it really does help sort of lift the ambiance up here. Now, in the back, like I said earlier, things are relatively comfortable. You still get all the same quality materials back here, except for the top of the door cards, which are now hard plastic. But all of the touch points like here and here, this is all nice fabric, all soft, this is all leather, which means it's quite nice to be seated back here. Rear seat accommodations are also well catered for because you have these very long seat squabs, which give you very, very good under thigh support, which is not something that you could say for a lot of C-segment SUVs. You have a couple of ISOFIX mounts back here as well, and there's no cover to them, so you just sort of have to push the ISOFIX fixtures all the way in, but they are very easy to locate. You have some bottle holders in the doors, but for cup holders you'll need to pull out the center armrest, which is also very well padded, and you just push for the cup holders to deploy like that, or if you don't want them, just push them back in and they've disappeared. This is a lot better implementation than a Volkswagen with the constantly visible cup holders in the middle, but overall it's a nice place to be back here. Now for children, like I said, the ISOFIX mounts are pretty well, they're reasonably placed and it's relatively easy to fit a car seat in here, but it is worth noting that these doors do not open all that wide, so if you have a hyper bulky car seat, it might be a bit of a problem. The other thing is that this belt line is kind of high, which means small children might get a little bit claustrophobic, but it is of course aided by that panoramic sunroof I mentioned earlier. Now, compared to the competition, like I said, knee and headroom is pretty good. These seats, like I said, are longer. The bases are longer, which means you should have better long distance comfort. But overall, it's sort of what you'd expect. I think this car's USP is definitely in terms of both the design, the presentation of the vehicle, as well as the materials chosen. Unfortunately, these seats do not recline, which means adult passengers back here can't get into like a super lazy position for long distance drives, but at least all three headrests are adjustable, so even when you're sat here the way you're supposed to be with your seatbelt on, you can sit quite comfortably over a longer distance. Now, in terms of NVH and comfort and ride and those controls that I mentioned earlier, these are all things that we should touch in the driving portion, which we will do now. So behind the wheel of the Peugeot 3008 is an experience of a lot of very familiar things. So for starters, this 1.6 litre turbo high pressure engine is, if I'm not mistaken, the same 1.6 litre Prince turbo engine that's used in many Mini models, and it's been used prolifically through the Peugeot lineup for some time, so this is an engine that we're quite familiar with. Paired to that is a 6-speed Aisin automatic gearbox with power sent to the front wheels. Now, even though the 1.6 HP is not the newest powertrain out there, it's certainly no slouch. It has plenty of power and plenty of torque, and paired to this 6-speed Aisin, because this is a pairing that has existed for some time, both parties work together really well, and as a result, power is delivered in a very immediate fashion and the gearbox responds relatively quickly too. Now, of course, if the mood takes you, you do have paddle shifters in the back of the relatively small steering wheel, but you can also press the M button at the base of the gear lever to engage manual mode should you want to have a little bit more fun with your car. Now, the thing about this powertrain and this overall sort of setup is that the Peugeot 3008 is actually a multi-award winning model. It's won awards locally and abroad for the fact that it is incredibly good looking, it's quite engaging to drive, and it's relatively well spec'd. And a lot of what we've seen before, a lot of what has been already established from the Peugeots of yore are coming through here too. For starters, the ride in this car is incredibly well judged. The primary and secondary ride are absolutely excellent, where the primary ride ensures that when you hit the bump, it smooths out the very worst of the imperfections, and the secondary ride ensures that the car settles down after an interruption like that relatively quickly. Now, what that means is, for drivers, it means that this car is very, very confidence-inspiring. It means that you can take it out on the motorway at relatively high speeds, you can take it through large, high-speed sweepers, and the car will remain very composed throughout. And what that means for passengers is that even on the very worst and most rutted roads, like the kinds that we get around PJ, at no point will this interior, will this cabin come across as being uncomfortable or even jittery for that matter. On top of that, when you pair that to the excellent build quality in this car, it means that there are no squeaks or rattles whatsoever. One of the easiest ways to make a car feel cheap is when the car encounters an imperfection. Immediately there are squeaks and rattles and bangs all across the cabin. Of course, you don't get that in the 3008. Adding to that sense of premiumness is also in terms of refinement. This engine, like I mentioned earlier, is pretty quiet. Despite its healthy performance numbers, it's not a raucous thing, which means that unless you're really going for it, you don't hear it much at all. At town speeds and stuff like that, it stays very quiet and very docile, and you rarely hear a peep out of it. It's only, again, at full throttle, like let's say when you're overtaking on a federal road, will it make itself a little bit known. But then again, the note and tone of this engine is hardly bad to hear, which means when you do hear it, it seems kind of pleasant, as it were. Now, on top of that, the rolling refinement in this car is also pretty good. You get very little in terms of wind and road noise. There is a little bit of whistle that'll come around here, and on particularly bad highways, for example, the NKVE, which uses a concrete mix, then you get a little bit of road noise, but even then it only occurs at speeds that you shouldn't be driving at anyway. For the most part, this car is very quiet, which means that when you want to drive over longer distances, for example, you won't really have to think about it. It's comfy, it's quiet, it's refined, and it'll ensure that passengers and the driver will get to the destination feeling relatively unflustered. Now, talking about touring, we need to talk about practicality. As I touched earlier when we did the walk around, the boot in this car is of a reasonable size, and of course the fact that there is a USB port in the back as well as a couple of aircon vents means that rear passengers should be well accommodated for as well. On top of that, even though this interior is all mostly black, you can sort of improve the ambience somewhat by opening this panoramic sunroof. Now, I have it shut right now because it's very hot and the panoramic sunroof is not tinted, and it must be said that when it is closed, there is absolute heat rejection. There is a little bit of warmth when I touch the surface, but otherwise it doesn't seem to be filtering into the cabin at all. Now, even if you have the panoramic sunshade closed, you still enjoy some degree of ambience in this car, particularly at night, because there are actually ambient lighting strips embedded onto the rails of the panoramic sunroof, which means at night, if you have the sunshade open, it'll bounce off of the glass. If you have the sunshade closed, it'll sort of reflect ever so slightly off of that fabric top, which again makes this car feel very premium. At 137,000 ringgit, or under 140,000 ringgit rather, it's very hard to find a compact SUV like this that feels quite so premium. In fact, I would go as far as to say that there are some premium compact SUVs that I've driven that don't feel this plush. Between the choice of materials like this lovely fabric along the sides of the doors, as well as the soft touch materials that they employ everywhere, the incredibly clear and sharp digital instrument cluster and center infotainment screen, as well as the tactility of all the knobs and switches, this car really feels upmarket. And then again, at 137,000 ringgit, upmarket is not really a term that gets bandied about a lot. Now, being a French car, not just a Peugeot, but being a French car, this car does have its foibles. Now, for starters, this driving position, the iCockpit design is not to everyone's taste, and having the steering wheel set down so low, for some people it might be very difficult to find a comfortable driving position. So again, like I said earlier, you really need to take these cars out on a test drive to understand whether or not this is going to be a good fit for you. Secondly, the glove box in this car is pathetically small due to the fact that a lot of the electrical gubbins like the fuse box and some wiring remains on that side even when this car was converted from left to right-hand drive. Now, on one hand, you could describe this as laziness. On the other hand, we could just be realistic about the fact that right-hand drive markets are very few and the volumes are very small, and so it's hard to justify the added expense for moving the fuse box from left to right, but ultimately that does mean that you have a tiny glove box. And lastly, the one that I'd like to touch on, the one I'd like to emphasize most of all, is actually the center screen. Now, like I said, it's very sharp and it's very bright and it's very nice to use, and the interface is quite pleasant. The only trouble is that they've put in the HVAC controls into the screen as well. And what that means is, if, for example, I'm on Android Auto with my navigation running and I'd like to change the temperature, for example, I have to tap on the screen and then it takes over the Android Auto in order to give me all of the aircon controls that I want, and then I have to press back to go back to Android Auto. And if, heaven forbid, I interfere too much, I might actually have to press the apps button and then press Android Auto to get Android Auto reloaded once again. And it just feels like this entire operation could have been reduced, minimized, or even removed altogether with the existence of some actual real HVAC control buttons separated from the infotainment system. Alternatively, there could have been a better way to integrate some of the most used HVAC features onto the side panels where the temperature, for example, is displayed at all times. Volvo, for example, does a thing where when you tap the temperature in order to change it, it only takes up a little bit of the screen, or it overlays onto your Android Auto so you can still keep sight of your navigation, for example. The fact that this takes over the entire screen, yes, it looks very good, but in practice it just doesn't, it sort of detracts from the experience a little bit. Too much jabbing at the screen means that your attention is taken off of the road, and that is a little bit of concern. But I think that the biggest issue that I have with this car, and this is a true issue, the rest of this is all niggles, but the only issue that I have with this car is in terms of safety. Now, the car does come with blind spot monitoring as standard, as well as things like rear cross traffic alerts and so on. Unfortunately, it doesn't come with autonomous emergency braking. Now, the lack of adaptive cruise control I can forgive. The lack of this car does come with lane keep assist, but it's not active lane centering. But even that, I'm willing to I think it's great that it comes with lane keep assist, although, lane centering would have been better still. But the lack of autonomous emergency braking is of particular note. More and more cars in this segment are coming with AEB as standard. In fact, even vehicles like the Peugeot Myvi now come with full level 2 semi-autonomy in their flagship models, which means that for 137,000 ringgit for a car like this from a brand like this, you would expect a little bit more. The Subaru XV that we drove recently, which is also roughly 140,000 ringgit, came with the new eyesight system, which has absolutely excellent adaptive cruise control and lane keep assist. And so getting into this car, it does feel like a very noticeable omission from the spec sheet. Now, I'm sure that BERMAZ Peugeot will be able to justify it by saying that they need to get it to a certain price point, or maybe because the fact that this car is ultimately just a facelift and this car didn't come as standard with it initially, maybe it was more difficult to integrate going forwards. But whatever the reason might be, the lack of AEB is especially noteworthy. Of course, if you wanted to really nitpick, you could say that a car like this should come with full level 2 semi-autonomy, but I'm willing to forgive it on the basis that so much attention to detail has been paid to all sorts of other areas, such as the refinement, such as the ride. And so these smaller matters I'm willing to forgive, because as an overall experience, this car is very pleasant. Through the weekend I had this, I was asked twice by two different people about if I had this kind of money, right? If I was in the market for a C-segment SUV, which one would I buy? Now, compared to vehicles like the Honda CR-V, for example, and so on and so forth, I believe that the 308 is actually the one I'd have. Yes, I do love Subarus, and I certainly think their eyesight system is laudable. The Proton X70 is an excellent car, and it's also very fun, very quiet. It does come at a certain price point. But the fact of the matter is, SUVs of this size are a dime a dozen. And so in order to stand out, you really need to go further afield. And the Peugeot 308 has always been able to offer that, the ability to stand out in a crowd. Now, the thing is, before, to recommend a Peugeot 308 came with a little bit of a caveat, understanding that, for example, resale value was quite tetchy, and after-sale service was also a little bit questionable. But now, under BERMAZ, they've not only managed to already improve the resale value. If you've seen used Peugeots on the market, they've all been creeping up in value as a result of BERMAZ's takeover of Peugeot distributorship here in Malaysia, but also because of BERMAZ's fantastic track record when it comes to after-sale service, it means that you can buy these cars with confidence. Of course, speaking of that, BERMAZ would like me to mention the fact that these cars come with a 5-year warranty, as well as a decent after-sales service package depending on how much you're willing to spend. And that does mean that if you are a new buyer into the Peugeot brand, you can buy with confidence. But that's enough of what BERMAZ wants me to tell you. Ultimately, it is this. The Peugeot 308 is an excellent SUV within this segment. It is refined, it is comfortable, it sets itself apart both inside and out. And as far as I'm concerned, it is an incredibly attractive package that you would be remiss to ignore if you're shopping in this segment. Of course, if you want the last word in safety, for example, you may be better suited by, say, a Subaru Forester with eyesight. If you want something that's a bit more dynamic to drive, perhaps consider the Mazda CX-5. And if you want a car that's large enough to double up as a commercial van from time to time, consider the Honda CR-V. But if you are a reasonable consumer, the 90th percentile of owners within this segment, the Peugeot 3008 will service you pretty well. And thanks to BERMAZ's takeover of the Peugeot brand here in Malaysia, it does mean that they should service you pretty well too. In any case, that's been our review of the new 2022 Peugeot 3008. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, jangan bodoh.